Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Natural History Institute. Wonderful to see you all here. My name is Tom Fleischner. I was the founding director of the Institute, and it is my pleasure and honor to introduce tonight's distinguished speaker. Before I do that, a couple of quick announcements, which you all know about. First, I have my prop. Please, if you haven't already done so, silence your cell phones. You don't want to be that person. Secondly, the bathrooms are actually right there, just past the base of the stairway, but you have to go around to get there. So if you come out of here, just keep turning right and you'll end up at the bathrooms. Okay, and a couple things. I wanted to mention the Institute has several upcoming programs to mention. One, Mindful Meandering on the Upper Verde River with Dr. Grace Burford, who's actually here tonight, right there. So if you have questions, you can talk to Grace. That's next Wednesday. Also, the wonderful expedition, The Natural History of the San Juan River in southern Utah. There's 1 or 2 spots left in that, so get them while you can. And then finally, Coming into Bloom, the Science and Personal Experience of Phenology. That's on June 5th. So if you have any questions about any of those programs, you can talk to any of the Institute staff here. Bob Ellis, the Executive Director, is right there. How about a round of applause for Bob Ellis? Also, Rebecca and Cheryl are here tonight from the Institute. So if you have any questions, you can talk to any of those folks or myself. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't remind you all, the Natural History Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit and prospers on the basis of the generosity of people like yourselves. We really try to keep programs like this free and available to everyone, but it's really wonderful if we can get support from our community. So talk to any of those same people. There's also a donation jar out in the lobby, okay? So with no further ado, I just wanted to very quickly introduce our wonderful speaker tonight, who many of you know, Alan Weisman. Alan, I would say it is no exaggeration to say, is one of the preeminent environmental journalists in the whole world. And he's done some remarkable work for many, many years. Half a dozen books, 6, 7, he lost count. As well as, and we'll be hearing about the most recent one tonight, as well as contributions to some of the top periodicals, the New York Times Magazine, the Los Angeles Times, Harper's, the Atlantic, et cetera, for many, many years. So he's a really important voice in connecting people and nature, which is, of course, the mission of the Natural History Institute. And we are just so thrilled to have him here tonight to share some of what he has been thinking about lately. In his work, Alan has reported from over 60 countries, all 7 continents, and I would say, to me, the kind of the field marks, you might say, of Alan, all of Alan's work is a wonderful and difficult synthesis between compassion for both the world and the people living in the world, critique of all of those things, and deep insight about all those. So he's a master storyteller and a master weaver together of many, many different threads. He's received more awards than I have time to tell you about tonight, and so I won't even try. He's also been a teacher, and as many of you know, that included a long stint here in Prescott, teaching at Prescott College for many years. So, like for many of you in the audience, I can say that for me, the pleasure tonight is not just professional, but also deeply personal, because Alan and I have been friends for a very long time and colleagues. 36 years ago, I think it was, when Edie and I moved to Prescott. We actually lived in Alan's house for our first 3 months. He was on a Fulbright in South America. Look at the New York Times Magazine article about that. And so a lot of my original musings in trying to figure out this landscape and what we came to call the Mogollon Highlands, much of that work was initiated at Alan's desk, quite literally. My first full-time field course was co-teaching with Alan and Doug Hume's down in Mexico, which I learned a great deal from too. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our friend and esteemed distinguished speaker, Alan Weisman. Oh, and I'll just say while he's getting ready there that we'll save question and answer till the end.
Wow. My gratitude to the Natural History Institute, not just for inviting me, but for existing. This place is wonderful. To many dear friends, thank you for coming. I learned how to write in this city, Prescott, Arizona, and my gratitude to Prescott and to Yavapai County is boundless. Okay. You wouldn't cover an apple with plastic wrap and then leave it in the sun, because pretty soon it would get warm and then soft and then develop those mushy brown spots and then rot. So why would anybody do that to their planet? But pretty much we have shrink wrapped ourselves in transparent layers of invisible CO2 and methane and nitrous oxide. Each year the temperature is setting new records. Fixing this won't be as easy as ripping away plastic film. Those gases aren't that easy to grip. Plus, we're not the only species that are feeling the heat. So do those who pollinate our food and break down our waste, enrich our soil, and fill our plates. But with climate cues gone all askew and natural habitats subsumed by sprawl and croplands, scientists fear that we'll lose species faster than they can count. So in 2019, I began investigating our realistic hopes for reining in climate change before it waxes out of control, at least enough to give us time to adapt, and for staunching the loss of our brethren species, and for somehow raising enough food for 2 billion more humans who are expected by 2050 without damaging the planet further. Little existential questions like that. So after a dozen countries, one global pandemic, and a brief stint in jail, I was reporting on protesters chained to a tar sands oil pipeline being rammed through Ojibwe country in northern Minnesota when an overzealous sheriff nabbed me too. Anyhow, after all of that, unexpectedly, I found myself thinking, yeah, maybe we can. Because everywhere I researched Hope Dies Last, my new book, I met inspiring, ingenious, stubborn visionaries. Engineers, scientists, agronomists, architects, artists, indigenous elders, Gen Z futurists, even the military. Imaginative people who refuse to quit trying to find us a viable future regardless of the odds, and sometimes pulling off some real surprises. So if this book looks thick, it's because about an inch of this is thanking all those people at great length, plus the bibliography. So don't be too daunted by the size of this thing. It's about 100 pages shorter than it looks. But as the Associated Press reviewer said after looking at the bibliography, he says, man, this isn't fake news. This one's documented and corroborated. So I start this book in one of the most symbolic places on earth, in southern Iraq, at the top of what its neighbor Iran calls the Persian Gulf, but neighbor Kuwait calls the Arabian Gulf. Does this sound familiar? But what starts there and lies above it is the Mesopotamian cradle of civilization. Many archaeologists and ecologists believe it's also a relic of the legendary Garden of Eden, which the Bible describes as where four great rivers meet: the Tigris, the Euphrates, and what corresponds today to a wadi that runs up through Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and the Karun, which pours down from Iran's Zagros Mountains. Now, descriptions of Eden in the Judeo-Christian Bible and in similar Sumerian and Akkadian stories predating it don't correspond much with the creation of a universe 13.6 billion years ago, but they do resemble the end of the Pleistocene, when the seas were 300 feet lower than today because so much of the Earth's moisture was still locked up in glacial ice. So for our hunter-gatherer ancestors, the exposed top of that gulf, this lush quadruple river delta, would have been a natural paradise, like the first chapter of Genesis describes. But after our forebears noticed that a handful of seeds would germinate where they spilled them, and also realized that they could capture and even breed game in corrals made of vines lashed around trees, to eat at their leisure rather than having to go hunt every day, well, then Genesis 2 retells the Bible's creation story. Suddenly, we're no longer gatherers, but tillers of a garden. But not for long, because archaeologists calculate that as the retreating Ice Age glaciers melted, the Persian-Arabian Gulf rose so fast that each generation had to retreat several kilometers to stay dry. So this place is also where the earliest versions of the flood and ark story begin. We see them in Sumerian and Sumerian cuneiforms. Well, today the seas are rising again. They're pushing salt water up the Tigris and Euphrates. Summer temperatures in southern Iraq can hover near 130 degrees Fahrenheit, which is well beyond the capacity for human sweat to, wick away. So when the cradle of civilization and of three great world religions becomes unlivable, I think that's telling us something. But I also went there to meet Azam Alwash, who, defying experts, saved the biggest wetland in the Middle East. During the 1990s, the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein had drained the vast Tigris-Euphrates marshes, which is this relic Eden ecosystem, to flush out Shiite rebels. By the time Hussein was deposed a decade later, in 2003, biologists declared it too desiccated, impossible to revive. Azam, who grew up fishing in the marshes, was a civil engineer, not an ecologist. But his career had taught him that nature is resilient and that impossible often masks a lack of imagination. How do we know unless we try, he asked. And this is a refrain that I would hear repeatedly from these stubborn visionaries I met worldwide, challenging conventional wisdom. So after fruitlessly begging for international assistance, including from the United States, which had further desecrated this hallowed cradle with a couple of disastrous invasions, finally, Azam's engineer colleague, Jassim al-Assadi, found and rented an excavator for the equivalent of $30. And they punched through Hussein's main diversion dike themselves. And for a month, the water that rushed in, mixed with parched soils, was this stinking rust red. But then cattail shoots appeared along the edges, and then papyrus and phragmites thick as bamboo. And soon the marshes were bright green. And the arrival of kingfishers and herons, egrets, pygmy cormorants meant that the fish were back. Spoonbills, ibis, godwits, marbled teals, two species of eagles once again spread throughout the reconstituted marshes. The endemic Basra warbler was heard again. Badgers, boars, otters, all these returning mammals and plants and fish, Euphrates soft-shelled turtles, they had have all restored a functioning ecosystem and a mecca for migratory birds. And they also welcomed home thousands of the Madan. Those are the indigenous marsh dwellers who have raised water buffalo there since the Sumerian times. In 2013, Azam and Jassim were awarded the Goldman Prize, the Environmental Nobel. But nothing's simple. Just last year, Jassim, who now heads the NGO they founded, Nature Iraq, was kidnapped by people demanding that he stop his environmental work in this World Heritage Site, beneath which lies oil. He refused. For 2 weeks they tortured him with daily electroshocks, holding his face underwater, beatings, but he was finally released, and he's back in the marshes today. I just heard from him. You will meet other brave people in this book who put their lives on the line for our futures, such as the Ojibwe women, their tribe's water protectors, who literally lay in front of bulldozers. I also go to some places where the battle to keep this planet livable is being waged that you might not expect, such as MIT's Plasma Physics Science Center, whose director, Dennis White, reminded me that to replace fossil fuel will mean replacing 82% of the world's energy. But White had a dream. Look, I am dubious that technology can alone save us from the messes that technology has created. But given our huge lopsided presence on this orb, I figure we're going to need its help. In fact, frankly, at this point, I think we need to try everything. So what MIT is trying truly is a technocrat's dream, trapping starlight on Earth to tap its essentially inexhaustible power derived from nuclear fusion, which is both carbon and radiation free. Now, fusion, as you may know, has long been perpetually called 20 years down the road, because getting hydrogen atoms to collide and fuse on Earth, which creates this burst of energy that Einstein described, that's always taken more energy to make it happen than it produced. But today, some half dozen attempts worldwide are racing each other and the climate crisis. And they're now led by a startup that's spun off of one of White's MIT plasma physics classes of what he calls the most brilliant 23-year-olds in the world. I describe in here one class, the 2015 class, achieving a thrilling technological breakthrough. They did it in the former Nabisco Oreo factory in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So this startup that they formed has now raised $2 billion in venture capital, which means that they are immune to capricious federal funding. And they currently are building a prototype fusion plant outside of Boston. It's designed to fit on a coal-fired plant's footprint so it could connect to existing transmission lines. And they're also designed to be mass-producible and to be assembled and easily serviced by any competent contractor and be cost competitive, especially because with fusion, there's nothing to mine. If it works, a liter of recyclable seawater could power your life pollution-free for a year. Now here's some even wilder technology. A legendary plant breeder named Molly John, you don't know her, but you sure know her delicata squash, among others. She became convinced that agriculture just has to stop plowing habitats and stop being addicted to chemicals. Not only are we using nearly half the unfrozen earth to feed one species, us, but synthetic fertilizer and the agriculture that it produces ultimately is responsible for a third of all our greenhouse gases. So Molly stepped down from being the dean of the University of Wisconsin's Agricultural School, and she convinced DARPA, the Pentagon's Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, to fund her scheme for a portable system to make food from thin air. It would feed airborne nitrogen hydrogen in the water molecule and that excess CO2 to fast-growing fermented microbes and add texture and flavor to make nutritious and tasty meals anywhere. Say, for starters, for a platoon of soldiers bivouacked far from supply lines, or to feed a group of starving refugees in a war zone. So one of the many ironies I discovered while researching this book is that the Defense Department may be the most forward-looking U.S. agency because DARPA is charged with seeking solutions to security problems that haven't even manifested yet, and to take wild risks, to dream up inventions that might truly change the game if only they existed, and then to try to build them. Its ARPANET became the internet. Its GUI lets us use it by pointing at pictures. DARPA also gave us GPS, the computer mouse, weather satellites, Siri drones, the use of mRNA to repel viruses, which led to the COVID vaccine. Some other ideas have proved less successful, such as plant-powered robots that could charge by reforaging, self-repairing living construction materials, and mechanical beasts of burden to lighten soldiers' loads. But DARPA's willingness to fail big en route to bold breakthroughs was ideal for Molly John, because this is her vision. Someday, she predicts, everybody's kitchen can be a farm. Not agriculture, but ubiquiculture. Another chapter follows a company and their farmers who are determined to completely replace synthetic fertilizer. And in another chapter, and I spent a lot of time on food, I look at how our crops might all be grown at sea using seaweed, and which apparently there's 12,500 species, and they're all edible. We only eat a few of them in sushi bars. And in that chapter, you'll also learn about plastic that is now being made from seaweed. I know this because in my talk the other night at Burbank, California, this company showed up to hand out their seaweed straws, which, when they become litter and end up back in the ocean, they will dissolve into seaweed molecules again. So, but I also looked at one even bigger kind of technology because it's one that much of the world is already counting on. And so I wanted to see whether it really works. From New Orleans after Katrina and New York after Superstorm Sandy, from sinking Jakarta and the drowning Marshall Islands, literally dozens more. In the 21st century, the world is turning to the Dutch to learn how they've managed not to drown over the past 1,000 years. For 10 days, I toured the Netherlands' ingenious defenses that hold back the sea and accommodate Europe's major rivers that all drain there. Collectively known as Delta Works, they are among human history's most ambitious civil engineering feats. And yet Dutch engineers admitted to me that if sea rise keeps accelerating and storms pound harder and more often by 2050, they may have to rethink their own vaunted technology or retreat to higher ground. You know, 2/3 of the Dutch live below sea level. Imagine that migration. I then joined a Dutch consultant in Bangladesh, which hopes to emulate the Netherlands, since both countries are 2/3 river delta. Only Bangladesh is 4 times bigger, with rivers like the Ganges and the Brahmaputra that dwarf the Rhine. And they pound down from these melting Himalayan glaciers to the, carrying like this Everest-sized load of silt to the fast-warming Bay of Bengal. So to afford this multi-billion-dollar Dutch climate protection, Bangladesh, when I went there, was trying to leap quickly into the upper middle class by, you may find this a little counterproductive, by building the world's second biggest coal-fired plant. Moreover, to import the coal cheaply from nearby India, they built it just upstream from the Sundarbans, which is the world's biggest mangrove forest and biggest Bengal tiger preserve, where I spent 3 days. I know, this stuff is maddening. I took a boat right up to its enormous smokestack. But here's a Dutch story that you will like better. In 2013, Marian Manesma pulled off what everybody thought was impossible. She still hears that. I thought it was possible, she said. Marian, who has 3 bachelor's and master's degrees, had directed green energy programs in a Greenpeace climate change campaign in Eastern Europe when she was invited to lead a Rotterdam University Sustainability Institute. Its doctoral students, she realized, produced books that at most 10 people would read. What are we really changing, she asked her co-director. So they brainstormed an action plan for every year up to 2050, spotlighting projects that show sustainability is more than new light bulbs or home insulation or switching to plant protein. What they called their urgent agenda for 2050 ended up on the front page of the biggest Dutch newspaper, generating thousands of emails, and thus was born their NGO, Urgenda. So in 2010, Mariam started wondering, why aren't there more solar panels? What's everybody waiting for? Well, the simple answer was that despite some government subsidies to help homes become energy neutral, only the wealthier businesses could afford 80 to 100,000 euros outlay for solar. That much is not necessary, she argued. Government experts disagreed. So she emailed the Urgenda membership saying that if they bought panels jointly, they could bring the price down themselves. Who'd be willing, she asked, to finance 35,000 euros, which is what they normally spend on energy for 15 years, if they knew they'd never have another energy bills? You could pay it back over 15 years, and for what you now spend on energy per month, it's a solution with no additional cost. So when the banks wouldn't loan her money, enough members were willing to advance a portion that she flew to China herself and bought 50,000 cheap solar panels, plus the connecting hardware. Today, Urgenda makes houses energy neutral for 35,000 euros. That's under that's about $30,000. We give them about 20 solar panels per house, heat pumps, an induction stove, and an electric boiler. Today, 2 million of the Netherlands' 7 million houses are solarized. And then in 2013, Urgenda made environmental history, not just in the Netherlands, but for the world. Marian had read a book by a Dutch attorney, Roger Cox, who argued that if governments fail to safeguard citizens and future generations against catastrophic climate change, the only remaining democratic recourse was to sue them. The Dutch government was signatory to statements like the UN's Convention on Climate Change that said industrial countries should reduce greenhouse gases 25 to 40% by 2020, but it had done nothing to remotely meet that goal. So Urgenda hired Roger Cox, and they sued, amassing 886 co-plaintiffs who accompanied them to deliver the summons in person. The youngest was 5 years old. They sued their government on the grounds that failure to address climate change was endangering its citizens' lives. The case was heard in The Hague in 2015. The Netherlands argued that it was too small to impact global climate. Cox replied that, hey, you guys have signed these accords stating the contrary for industrialized nations, regardless of size. And the judges agreed. The government was obliged to reduce national emissions by at least 25% by 2020. The government appealed on 29 grounds, and assuming it would be overturned, did nothing. The appeals court rejected all 29. So the Netherlands appealed again to its own Supreme Court, which in 2019 upheld both lower courts' rulings. It was unprecedented anywhere in the world, a climate case successfully adjudicated against a government under its own laws. But winning would be meaningless if the government couldn't comply, so Urgenda was ready with a list of 54 actions that together would mitigate 17 megatons of CO2 to fulfill the court order. The measures range from more rooftop solar to reducing speed limits, compulsory LED lighting in greenhouses, extinguishing office and business lights after hours. And in 2022, Marianne Manesma was awarded the Goldman Environmental Prize. Using their same language and same lawyers, in 2018, Friends of the Earth Netherlands filed suit in the same court against the country's biggest, most valuable company, Royal Dutch Shell. Climate policy is focused on nations, said its director. That excludes the biggest polluters, multinationals, who are not regulated. The 25 biggest literally produce half. That's like 25 CEOs who could fit in a city bus responsible for half of all global emissions. And again, they won. And they expected to win an appeal in the same courts where Agenda triumphed, but Shell didn't wait to find out. After 131 years, it dropped Royal Dutch from its name and moved its headquarters to London. Like I said, nothing simple. I have another courtroom story that's set here in the Southwest. It involves a few contract biologists, one of them a Prescott College graduate, who sued their employer, the U.S. Forest Service, basically for trying to inflate the count of Mexican spotted owls in New Mexico to prove they weren't in danger so they could sell clear-cutting leases. The biologists were fired, of course. But to their surprise, their case proved uncontestable, and they won. So next, they tried suing the Defense Department for violating the Endangered Species Act because a White Sands Missile Range commander had once acknowledged that wolves could successfully be reintroduced there, but did nothing. They won that too, and then kept winning. Today, the Tucson-based Center for Biological Diversity that they founded drives many people crazy, possibly including some in this room. It employs teams of ecologists, strategists, and lawyers that wield one of the world's most powerful environmental laws, the Endangered Species Act, like a bludgeon. They have sued now more than 900 times on behalf of animal and plant life, from polar bears to orchids to slugs, and they've won nearly 90% of their cases. Once, a Forest Service lawyer in court got so frustrated he actually leapt for their attorney's court. They won that case. They have compelled ranchers to stop grazing along stream beds because they're home to goshawks and southwestern willow flycatchers. That was the first time that courts declared that vulnerable wild creatures might be more valuable than cows. I know, this is Yavapai County, that's blasphemy. Sorry. Okay. So for this chapter, I went into Mexico's Sierra Madre and Arizona's Sky Islands as the center plotted to help jaguars that once lived as far north as the Grand Canyon reestablish themselves in the American Southwest, again using the Endangered Species Act. President Richard Nixon signed that act, but now President Donald Trump threatens to defang it, along with protections for forests and waters and the climate. Besides his border wall, which jaguars still find their way around, he's now trying to redefine protection of endangered plants or animals as not including protection of their habitats from overexploitation. To assert that any species could be safe if its home isn't would be like taking the White House, Trump Tower, and Mar-a-Lago away from him to see how long he'll survive roofless and without air conditioning or food. Yeah. Speaking of food, there's a rather delicious story in here of another noted Prescott College alum, Dr. Gary Paul Nabhan, and his wife, Dr. Lori Monty, who together bring the Comcac, the Sonora Seri Indians, bring them together with a 3-star Michelin Spanish chef. Chef Angel Leon grew up in El Puerto de Santa Maria on Cadiz Bay. That's the bay in southwestern Spain that Columbus sailed from. His restaurant there, A Poniente, was named the Earth's most sustainable by world's 50 best restaurants for wasting no part of every fish, finding something savory to do with everything in the net, and for eating lower on the marine food chain than anyone had ever imagined. Chef Angel marinates discarded fish parts in sauces made from mackerel eyes, sea worms, jellyfish, fish bones. He makes savory wafers from sardine scales. He has recipes for plankton that he raises himself. He's perfected algae spaghetti, marshweed honey, crisp moray skin eel, moray eel skin, melanges of sea vegetables, bioluminescent soup, and sea charcuterie, which blood sausages, mortadella, bacon, pig skins, and hams, all confected from unwanted parts of fish, mussels, sea bass, squids, whatever the fishermen bring him. Alongside his food laboratory, he houses a nonprofit research institute dedicated to restoring the Bahia de Cádiz. And he's now trying to see if local eelgrass grain, this is the same species whose grain the seri once harvested traditionally in the Sea of Cortez. See if it can be domesticated to give humanity another cereal crop that can grow in seawater. The seris foraged it wild. They never aim for mass production. But even if it proves impossible, Angel Leon is convinced that it will be an instructive failure. With the land overexploited, he says, the sea is the future of our food. We're opening windows into that future. Sooner or later, the world is going to have to look through them. Well, I have a chapter about how can cities possibly be sustainable, livable places in this book. And I'm not going to talk about all of them right now, but one of the issues that I talked to Chef Leon about, and oh, by the way, for that chapter, which is set on both the Sea of Cortez and in Spain, for research purposes, I was forced to eat a 3-star Michelin meal. Fortunately, it was tax deductible. My accountant is in this room, by the way, so. Anyhow, what we talked about is the fact that 2/3 of the people on Earth live within a couple hundred kilometers of a coastline. In the book, you will see all the major financial capitals on our planet that are coastal cities. And the coastlines are changing. What is going to happen? So in one of the cities that you'll read about, Busan, Korea, what is happening right now is that they figure, well, this is the port that all of your Samsungs and Hyundais and LG stuff comes out of. You know, if the city can't, you know, retreat and the sea is going to wash over it, maybe the best thing to do is to build a city that will float and rise up with it. And so you'll enjoy the story about the floating cities in here. The Ojibwe women that I met in northern Minnesota were unable to stop Enbridge Line 3 pipeline, which is carrying Athabascan tar sands crude. It's one of the filthiest of all fossil fuels, right through their wild rice harvesting grounds and under 200 lakes and rivers, including the Mississippi. But their elders never stop resisting. I mean, they've been doing this for 500 years, you know, even after multiple arrests. And one of them, Winona LaDuke, you'll see how after she got out of jail, we were almost cellmates. She's now opened a solar furnace factory that provides both warmth and good jobs on the reservation, the White Earth, and also commercial hemp farming as an alternative to working on the corporate McDonald's French fry potato plantations that surround her reservation. And at one point, Winona says, the only path to hope is to hope big. I love that quote. because it epitomizes the visionary thinking, seeing the big picture, then daring to take big risks, to take on big power, even daring to fail big, especially when honor is at stake, and then strategizing what to do next. The same conviction inspires Jelton Anjane, whose father was called the Moses of the Marshall Islands, for rescuing his people from an atoll that the U.S. had irradiated during hydrogen bomb tests. Jelton now educates the descendants of those survivors in a sustainability lab that's funded by the Roddenberry Foundation, the Star Trek people, and the U.S. Navy, that will both make the Marshalls a more livable place, as long as they're still above water, but also prepare the next generation to go into the diaspora with good employable skills, should they ever have to abandon their home islands. And, you know, sad? Yeah, but not hopeless. You know, in life, we can never let grief defeat us. In one of the world's poorest places that I've ever been, certainly, a Rohingya refugee camp on the Myanmar-Bangladesh border, I found one of the most hopeful stories in the book. I saw a solar and battery-powered Wi-Fi network that lets people living in stifling one-room huts trade and share energy with their neighbors to power fans and light bulbs and to charge mobile homes. And each cluster of huts is connected by Wi-Fi to surrounding clusters, and so on, and so on. A whole network, all without power lines. This peer-to-peer networks creator, a Dhaka-based company called SoulShare, is now outfitting and connecting Bangladesh's 3 million plus electric rickshaws with solar rechargeable batteries, whose remaining juice each night will help feed the national grid. It's technically easy, and it's clean, and it saves everybody money, and it makes so much sense. At one point, here in the United States, I followed an unlikely collection of self-described nerds, Gen Zers, and queers who call themselves climate defiants. They scream truth right into the face of power by hounding politicians who take oil money. They do this by leaping onto the stages when they're speaking to accuse them of frying their future. I saw them do that to the CEO of Bank of America, one of the world's biggest fossil fuel financiers. And they harassed a deputy interior secretary, the one who approved the Willow Project in Alaska, so much that he quit. And they were key to getting President Biden to pause the liquid natural gas plant buildup on the Gulf Coast, which President Trump has unfortunately resumed. Climate defiance hasn't stopped under Trump. Now they're getting thrown in jail, but they keep coming. Look, I know so far Congress and the courts have let the president break laws with impunity, and some people are just fine with that. But I don't care what your political stripe is. He can't break the laws of physics. You know, we have had to invent a whole new vocabulary to describe what overheating the atmosphere does. Megafires, gigafires, bomb cyclones, atmospheric rivers. Well, presidents can hide in bunkers, but voters can't. And next time, I'm betting that they're going to know what to do. Look, Hope Dies Last doesn't pull any punches about the quandary that humanity and all other species currently face. While working on this, I would tell people that I did not set out to write a book about solutions, but rather an explanation of what hope still means as we stand at an existential brink. But by the end, it turns out I did. we're the solutions. Hope isn't just wishing for something to happen. Hope is an action verb, not a passive state. The surest way to fail is not to try, so we must. Everyone I have portrayed in this book is scared of how things could end up unless somebody acts. So they do. They don't wait for miracles, they keep trying to make them. So we can open up to questions, but I just wanted to share with you that while researching this, I made two of what you might arguably call spiritual pilgrimages. One was in Najaf, Iraq, to the tomb of Imam Ali. He's Muhammad's son-in-law, who Shiite Muslims believe the Prophet named as his heir. And the Sunnis, as you may know, believe that the spiritual lineage go through one of Muhammad's fathers-in-law. Look, I'm not a Muslim or anything else, but I went there because the Shiites also believe that Imam Ali is buried alongside Adam and Noah. In fact, he was assassinated while praying at the house where Noah allegedly built his ark. The Center for Biological Diversity and this Natural History Institute are essentially trying to do the same thing as Noah. Lifeboat enough species into the future to make sure this earth remains viable, hopefully with us, which is what this book is about. My other pilgrimage was during my trip along the Mesoamerican Reef, which is the world's second longest after Australia's Great Barrier Reef. It runs along the top of the Yucatan Peninsula down past Belize and Guatemala and across northern Honduras. And I was there with scientists from Stanford and the World Wildlife Fund and some NASA climate modelers who were briefing local coastal conservationists and refuge managers on what they're going to be facing upcoming and plotting how to respond. For example, instead of building rigid breakwaters that end up failing, they can encourage mangroves, oyster beds, seagrasses, salt marshes, sand dunes, all natural storm buffers that can move with the changing coastlines to soften the impact on human coastal communities. While I was in the Yucatan, I paused in the seaside hamlet of Chicxulub. That's where 66 million years ago an asteroid finished off 75% of all species on Earth, including big reptiles that had ruled here for 160 million years. Except, that is, for some tiny feathered dinosaurs who today are still flying in our midst, singing to us each morning. And there was also a small shrew-like mammal who managed to survive in burrows, named Purgatorius. That's our ancestor, yours and mine. A few weeks later, I was with those NASA modelers again at the Goddard Institute of Space Studies in New York, and there I met the eloquent climate research physicist Kate Marvel, who was studying the Paleo-Eocene thermal maximum, or PETM, which was a large-scale release of carbon dioxide about 55 million years ago. That's the best historical analog for what we are going through right now. What's fascinating about the PETM, she said, is that despite really pronounced warming, there's no geological record of a mass extinction. But since this was just 10 million years after the dinosaurs died, it's possible that the species that survived could basically survive anything. But Kate Marvel is convinced that survival is still our option if we choose it. Whenever she hears someone say that it'll take a miracle to escape this existential mess that we've created, she has a ready reply. I believe in miracles. I live on one. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan. We have time for a few questions and answers. I forgot to mention before, this program is being live streamed, so when we do if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand and wait for me to give you the microphone so that people who are watching online can hear and so that everybody in the room can hear. So do you want to call on people or do you want me to? All right, Ken, if you want.
Anybody have a question? Come on, I haven't left you all speechless. Am I still like? Yeah.
Everybody's
Wow.
inspired and stunned.
Or anxious to get out of here. So.
Any? Yeah, here.
I guess it's almost more of a statement than a question, but I feel like a lot of individuals are ready and willing to act, but they don't know what direction to go in. You know, many people don't, we're not all Martin Luther Kings. We don't have broad views about what to do as individuals. And what would you say to all of us?
I would say that there's a whole lot you can do. First of all, start in your own home. And I know sometimes you have to close your eyes and sign the check. But if you invest in things like solar, induction stoves, heat pumps, they will pay for themselves. You know, our solar panels 8 years ago have paid for themselves, and now they're paying us back. And we closed our eyes and put in heat pumps this year. That's something that you can do without leaving home. But frankly, we're going to have to get out there if we're not happy with the direction that things are going in. You can do that also by writing a check to support some of those organizations that are trying to keep nature alive on our planet, or are trying to keep, you know, the sun from frying us to a crisp. Because, you know, at one point for this book, I interviewed the head of Google's AI climate program. And he said, you know, after 1.5 degrees of temperature gain, average temperature gain, he says, which is right about where we're at right now. He said it's going to be a knife fight for every 1/10 of a degree after that. He said, but it's a good knife fight to be in. And that is the spirit that we need. I mean, this is a time for humanity to rise up and do everything we can. If that means getting out in the streets for a protest, great. If that means sending money to those protesters so they can go and gather in Washington, they are beginning to gather in bigger and bigger numbers. You know, as Tom said, I've worked in over 60 countries. I've worked in some really nasty dictatorships, you know, places like Libya under Gaddafi. When I was in Bangladesh for this book, Bangladesh was a dictatorship ruled by a woman named Sheikh Hasina, who was the daughter of the founding president of Bangladesh. She started off as a progressive, but then began lengthening her term in office and then began quelching dissent and throwing her opponents into jail. And the journalists that I met there, boy, they were some of the most cautious journalists I've ever met. You had to be really careful about how you said what you said. While I was home writing this book, a bunch of students protested. And it was something that might sound pretty innocuous. They wanted more government jobs opened up to them because a lot of them were just going on, they were patronage jobs. She sent police after the protesters. They stayed. Then she sent soldiers, and 120 students were slain. And suddenly the country woke up and said, no more. And people poured into the streets and said, no more. And 5 days later, she fled the country, and her chief opponent, a Nobel Prize winner who she was insanely jealous of and kept trying to throw in jail, he's now running the country. So, you know, I think that, you know, again, I don't want to offend anybody's politics here, but to me, the current administration, it's been terrifying, but it's also been clarifying. It showed us that this democracy that we grew up in, all of us were raised in it, you know, in one of the longest eras of at least domestic peacetime, you know, in history. You can pull out a few blocks of the foundation, suddenly things can start to tumble really fast. It's fragile. But the same thing can be said of an autocracy, particularly when all the wealth and power rises to the top. It's easier for them to collapse into their own weight when they do. There are things that you can do. I know, I don't want to be on the streets either, but this is the time that we have to stand up.
Do you know about Stephen Greer's zero energy, all the sources of, you know, do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't know about Stephen Greer, but...
The 0 point energy?
Well, there are, I mean, if 0 point energy means the point where our energy is creating a zero impact, you're going to find a lot of that in this book, because I look at a lot of different systems. I mean, you heard this wonderful story from Bangladesh. It's so easy. Solar energy is so cheap. In fact, the thing in the Rohingya refugee camp, and there's over 1 million people in those camps. I mean, it's crazy. It's also happened in the South Sudan refugee camps. And, you know, maybe someday, hopefully those people are going to get to go home. Well, they're going to leave behind a big solar battery for the country. You know, frankly, we could do this whole thing with solar and wind right now. We could. And it's economically feasible. Solar is being used in Scandinavia. I mean, there's no reason why we shouldn't be using it. And the state of Arizona, which I am very grateful to for having lived here for so many years, every rooftop should be collecting the sun and feeding it into the grid.
Maybe time for one or two more, because I know a lot of people are interested in buying books and having Alan sign them. Anybody else have a question?
Thank you. I've been impressed with how human society can twist on a dime, like, for example, the fall of the Berlin Wall, which happened with nobody anticipating it in a matter of hours. But the biogeochemical cycles of the planet move a little more slowly and are less forgiving. So this shift will have to be sustained. How do you anticipate when society finally makes that shift that we'll be able to sustain it over the time needed to affect change, real change?
Well, you know, that's a really good question. I mean, first of all, that biochemical system is going to eventually find equilibrium. Some of you know my second to last book, The World Without Us, in which I theoretically removed us from the landscape just to see how fast nature can recover, and it turns out surprisingly fast. And you know, I didn't write that book because I want a world without us. I really wanted a world with us. I'm fond of my species. I like to say that I'm married to a Homo sapiens. And, but so what I was hoping was that readers would see this restored earth and say, you know, so how can we add ourselves back to this picture only in, you know, in harmony, in not mortal combat with the planet? look, for reasons that I described in my last book, Countdown, and I also reiterate briefly in this one, the last century totally changed this planet because of the invention of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. By being able to pull nitrogen out of the air and chemically slather it on the ground, suddenly we could grow much more plants than nature ever could. And that, even much more than modern medicine, that is the reason why our population quadrupled in a single century. And in biological history, that may be the biggest population spurt for a large animal. Like I say, I love my species, but you know, sometimes too much of a good thing is just too much. And we are just pressuring the land right now. And we're force feeding our food supply with chemicals that are doing all this damage. So you will meet in this book all these people who are trying to get around synthetic nitrogen, trying to come up with a solution to that. The transition over the next century or so is not going to be easy. But we, I think, can do it. Look, I'm just a journalist. I'm not an expert. I talk to a lot of experts. The scientists I have spoken to really believe that there is a way that we can still come to a reasonable working agreement with the rest of this planet so that the human experiment is not over. You know, but if we blow it, well, look, what I learned from the world without us is that the planet's going to be fine. I mean, it's survived 5 major extinction events before the one that we're perpetrating, and each time it comes back in these gorgeous and surprising and exciting ways, and it will survive us too. But I am hopeful that our better angels will help us know what to do, take this age of information that we are drowning in, make it the age of wisdom, and really start doing the right thing. So one other thing I would like to say, and then I'll shut up and sign books. The other thing that we can be doing is your kids, your grandkids, those kids, you know who I'm talking about. Take them into nature. You know, you may have to jerk them away from their glowing screens, but just go for a walk with them. Some of the most formative things that ever happened to me in my life were the 2 times that my dad took me for a walk in a wildlife preserve. And they'll be sullen at first, but then they'll see something, they'll spot something, and they will look at it and they'll get interested in it. And you can look at it. If you know somebody, you can tell them about it. And by the second time you take them out there, they're going to be explaining it to you. Because nature has that effect. We're all part of nature. And something in our organism relates to those plants and to those sounds of birds and insects. There's one other thing I want you to do. Don't raise them, once they have fallen in love with nature, don't raise them to be angry at our species for having screwed up so much. Yeah, we've banged this planet really hard, but there's still a lot of nature out there. It's still beautiful. We've got a much richer baseline than those last extinction events had. So what I would like you to do is to take them to museums and take them to concerts and take them to art galleries. Let them see that the human species is capable of creating beauty. Let them feel proud to be a human being. Let them want to be the kind of human being that spreads beauty on this earth and that preserves beauty on this earth. An adult paying attention to a kid, I mean, think back in your own lives. Those 2 or 3 adults who made all the difference. Be the difference for them.
Thank you so much, Alan, for all your wonderful work in the world and for this much-needed infusion of hope for all of us here tonight. We have a tradition here at the Natural History Institute to give a Natural History Institute hat to each speaker, so I'd like to present this to my good friend here. So our good friends from the Peregrine Book Company are sitting right out here if you're interested in buying books, and Alan is happy to sign them. Also want to mention that there's a wonderful new art show in the gallery by Jan Tomlinson Master, who came out from Florida to set this up. Really beautiful show, so that is open right now as well. And talk to any of us from the Institute if you're interested in some of those program ideas. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Alan.